Afternoon. Welcome to our second program in our 2023 Racial Justice Training Series, Advocating for Play, Recreation, and Leisure as Essential to Adolescent Development and Youth Defense. We're so happy to see you all here today. And to get us know a little bit about you while we tell you a little bit about our speakers, we're hoping you can let us know if you are a youth defender, youth advocate, a mitigation specialist, a judge, social worker. Who do we have with us in the audience today? If you could just put that in the chat and I'll tell you a little bit about who our speakers are today. So we are delighted to be joined today by Dr. Linda Caldwell and Chris Henning. Dr. Linda Caldwell is an Emeritus Distinguished Professor in the Department of Recreation, Park and Tourism Management at Penn State University. Her research has focused on interventions that develop youth competencies, promote healthy lifestyles, encourage healthy behavior through leisure. Over the past 30 years as a prevention scientist, Linda has authored over 100 peer-reviewed articles, some of which you've seen in Professor Chris Henning's book, and held a professorship in Iceland and South Africa, and recently completed a Fulbright in Portugal. She's co-editor of the book, Youth Development Principles and Practices in Out-of-School Time Settings, and the author of Time Wise, Taking Charge of Leisure Time, a Curriculum for Adolescents. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Caldwell. We're also so excited to be joined by our professor, author, friend, who's helped us develop this racial justice training series, Professor Chris Henning. Chris, of course, is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative. Chris has represented young people in DC Superior Court for more than 3 decades. She's inspired and taught countless numbers of youth defenders and advocates, and she trains a wide array of justice decision makers on the role of race in the juvenile legal system. And of course, she's the author of Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. We're so grateful to have her and her experience and her wisdom here today, and so excited to bring together researcher and author for continuing this conversation about how we as a youth defense community can advance this notion of a young person's right to play. So we're going to do 4 things in this program today. 1, we're going to examine the importance of the role of play, recreation, and leisure in young people's lives, and especially their development. 2, we're going to understand how Black adolescents and other young people are deprived of play across this country, but most especially in the juvenile and criminal legal systems. We're going to discuss strategies for protecting and advancing the right to play, recreation, and leisure. And then we're going to talk about how we can incorporate the science, research, and advocacy in what we do with and on behalf of young people as they engage in communities they live in our advocacy and youth defense. So as we start, we just want to ground ourselves in this work and ask both of you, why is this topic so important to you and your work? We'll start with you, Professor Chris Henning, 60 seconds.
All right. Thank you, Mary Ann. I really love this intersection between the research and the practical application to the juvenile legal system. For so many Black and brown children, the denial of an opportunity to play is a direct line to the juvenile and criminal legal system. So we really should start talking about the playground to prison pipeline. And then not only are kids often arrested for normal adolescent play, recreation, and leisure, but once they enter the system, they are further denied an opportunity to play.
Thank you so much, Chris. So happy to have you with us. And Dr. Caldwell, same question to you. Why is this topic so important to you in your work?
Well, I'm happy that I'm retired, so I have no work to apply it to. But it's been, and when I was a kid, I had some friends who used drugs. Imagine that. And nobody that I know of got arrested, but we hung out at the YWCA. And for some reason, my mind connected. The woman who was there was way ahead of her time. And she took this group of hippie, no-fits together and helped mold them. And that just really resonated with me. So as I moved through my academic career, it's like, whoa, this is really important work. And I'm going to learn more about it and help to do something about it.
I love that. I love the personal experience and story of sharing of how you came to really learn about and have a passion for this work. And so just very quickly, we're going to ask all of you to put in the chat, what was your favorite mode of play, recreation, and leisure when you were a teenager? And while you're doing that, I'm going to do the same thing, turn to our panelists and ask them, What was your favorite mode of play, recreation, or leisure when you were a teenager? Dr. Caldwell, Linda.
I don't know that I kept thinking about this question. I don't know that I have a favorite, but I loved being out of doors and walking in the woods and doing hikes even by myself and riding my bike. So I think that for me is what I would say the favorite.
Wonderful. Love it. Just being outside. And I love one of the responses is roaming around outside. And Chris, what was your favorite mode?
So I think mine, or at least one of mine, was roller skating.
Oh, you muted yourself when we heard roller skating. Okay.
Yeah, I got excited. I was like, oh, but it was
love it.
roller skating on Sunday nights. That was the thing. You had to like be on best behavior all week. So mom and dad would let us go roller skating. So that was it.
Beautiful. And we cruised around our neighborhood on bikes all day, all night, just rode around on our bikes and just groups of kids all over the place. So I think it's just great for us to have a grounding and understanding of this is what we all experience. There is a lot of this that's common sense to the experience that we had as young people and that we want our young people to have, especially young people in Black and Latino and Indigenous communities who we know are over surveilled. So let's jump right in. Last year, I hope many of you joined us for our Chapter of the Month program that was focused on Chris's book, Rage of Innocence. We had a great conversation about the long history of how adolescent play has been criminalized in this nation, especially for young people of color. And we talked about the value of play. If you haven't seen it, we have a video of it and you can go to that link. We put that in the chat for you. So today we're excited to continue that conversation and delve into why play, recreation, and leisure are so vital to adolescent development. So we're really going to look at the developmental benefits of play as a way to help us strengthen our advocacy around this issue. And really going to focus on how we as youth defenders and advocates and others of you who are joining this conversation can be thinking about and making decisions about young people based on this increased understanding and knowledge. So as we start, I want to be sure that we're all on the same page. It's really easy to rattle off all different kinds of play, and we had lots of great examples in the chat. I loved seeing the many modes of play, tag and bike riding and boxing and dance and all the things that you all shared with us. But Dr. Caldwell and Chris, what does play look like for young people today? I want to start with Linda, Dr. Caldwell, and ask you to just talk with us a little bit about what it looks like. And just to note, for purposes of this discussion today, we're going to be using those terms, play, recreation, and leisure, interchangeably. So, Linda, what does it look like for us today, for young people?
Well, I'm sorry, Miriam. I'm going to start off being really wishy-washy. You know, a professor on this hand or on this hand, and can't make up your mind, right? But honestly, you know, play, recreation, leisure is so idiosyncratic. It's so personal. So it really can be almost anything. And it is very difficult to challenge. And you don't want to be in classes in leisure studies departments and trying to fight over definitions, because that's just no fun. But basically, you know, these things that we're talking about are like activities and behaviors, experiences, the context that happens during typically a period of time that's called unobligated or free time. So in that essence, though, that's really the essence of what these things might look like. So they could be structured or unstructured, you know, like reading or in a book club or walking around the mall or playing basketball, like the song, or a school club. Anything like that can really be, so it's really in the eyes of the beholder. And I'll come back to that later on.
Thanks so much, Linda. And I love that it's really personal and idiosyncratic, but that it's about free time. Chris, you're a defense attorney. You represent young people in DC. You have for over 3 decades, young people who live in urban settings. What does play look like for the young people that you represent?
Yeah, I bet you folks from across the country can relate to the young people, one, hanging out in front of McDonald's. You would think that it was like an amusement park, but large groups of kids in front of McDonald's, large groups of kids just hanging out after school, laughing, talking in front of Rita's Ice. Linda, you already talked about the mall, just going to the mall in huge numbers. Another one is like riding the public transportation in DC, specifically the metro, just riding the metro back and forth, for fun, right? Not just as a mode of transportation. Also, a lot of the young people that I work with, sitting in folding chairs out in front of their apartment building, whatever that is, right? Or sometimes in the backyard, playing dice in the backyard, listening to music, you name it. So it's, hanging out very often after curfew. I like to point that out. That's just what kids do. So all of that in my mind is recreation, play, and leisure.
I love that. Thanks, Chris. And I think what we're hearing from both of you is it really can be almost anything. And I loved all of the contributions from you, the participants: soccer, reading, swimming, horse riding, football, dodgeball, video games, right? It really does mean almost anything. And it's so personal. But as advocates, Linda, we want to really understand what are the critical aspects of what makes something play, recreation, or leisure? What are the key features so that we can understand in our work with young people what makes it play, recreation, and leisure, and help us understand why at times is a teen walking around the mall with their friends considered play, recreation, or leisure, but if they're with their mom or an authority figure, it might not be. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the key features are?
Sorry, I couldn't find my cursor to unmute. Yeah, that's a really great example to bring in some of these elements, the fundamental ideas around play, recreation, and leisure. So when I heard that, I'm thinking, well, walking around the mall with their mother really could be a chore, or it could be something that they've looked forward to, and it could be a leisure experience because perhaps the mother works all of the time and the child does get a chance to spend time with the mother. So when I look back when I was a teen, I didn't like going through the mall with my mother at all, but I think that's an example of how one activity can be viewed differently by different people, or it can be experienced differently by different people. So what is play for one day for one person might not be play for that person the next day. For me, you just can't look at an activity and define what that is for that person. My husband loves golf. I mean, he's one of those addicted guys who plays golf all the time. If you saw me on the golf course and you thought I was having fun, you would be wrong, because that is not something that I enjoy doing at all. As a matter of fact, I hate it. So it would be just that opposite experience. So this goes back to the notion that it's very, very much subjective and personal. I think, however, having said all of that, there are really fundamental, important parts of the recreation, leisure, play experience. Mostly it's characterized by free choice and self-determination. So participation is voluntary. And I think that's just really an essential part. I'll come back to it in a minute. And so it has to be pleasurable. It could be relaxing, exciting, meaningful. Some of your ideas that, we all have different things we need at particular times during the leisure experience. Sometimes it can be alone. Sometimes it can be with others. Sometimes it's planned. Sometimes it's solitary. The point that I want to make to all of this right now is that consider how difficult it really is to be self-determined. I mean, being totally self-determined is very difficult. And it's especially true as young people go through the process of development. My nephew and his wife and their 9 and 8-year-old kids are here. And I've been thinking about this, and because the 9-year-old little boy, Cooper, loves fishing, and he loves this and he loves that, and he wants to do this and he wants to do that and he wants to do it now, and he can't all the time. because the parents are like, no, no, no. Then I'm thinking, okay, Cooper's 9 now. What happens when he's 15 or 16? How is that relative self-determination and freedom going to play out? And the reason I'm making this point is because the leisure context is really a contested area for a lot of kids and caregivers or adults, because they need more freedom. They want more self-determination. They want to make their decisions. So I think that whole autonomy issue is very, very important when we're thinking of adolescent development, partially because it helps them develop initiative and goal setting. The other thing to note is that contexts for adults who are autonomy supporting really help promote adolescent development, and there, the whole host of things that adolescents develop. That people, autonomy, controlling context really not only thwart participation and healthy participation, but it also has deleterious effects. So I think this whole notion of relative freedom, relative intrinsic motivation is really important. I'm going to see here what else I might have wanted to say. I think another thing to consider is that a lot of research shows that when activities are internally motivated, they're much more likely to be continued. So, my mother wanted me to take piano lessons. Okay, I took piano lessons. It was not intrinsically pleasing to me, and I just never was able to keep it up. Chris, our little fisher guy, he's going to be fishing the rest of his life because he wants to do this fishing. And this sets good habits and good trajectory for adults if you start these passions as adolescents.
Thanks so much, Dr. Caldwell. I love the term adults who are autonomy supportive. I hope all of us who are working with young people just grasp onto that. Chris, these characteristics, you want to talk a little bit about your experience with them, facets?
Well, listening to I'm gonna have to work on calling you Linda, not Dr. Caldwell myself, but listening to Linda, there were several things that really jumped out, like this notion of it being contextual and idiosyncratic and self-determined, autonomous, freedom. I would add joy that makes you, that brings joy. And I was thinking about even my own response. What did I enjoy? I said, skating, right? Going to the skating rink on a Saturday night. Others of you talked, as Marianne read out, soccer, softball, horseback riding. You talked, Linda, about fishing, but think about some of the young people, I'm a defense attorney, and young kids that I represent who are, just don't have access to some of those opportunities. Some do, of course, many do, of course, but that hanging out at Rita's Ice or in front of Rita's Ice is joy, right? It's laughter, it's boisterous, it's fun, it relieves stress. It is all the things that you talked about, right? It develops social skills. You can sit and watch sort of the, with humor, if you will, the crowd of kids, and you could see who are the leaders in the crowd, right? Who are the comedians in the crowd? That is a real developmental assets, So I just thought, listening to my list compared to the list that others have generated, I'm like, it's a lot of the same developmental features and joy, even if it doesn't look the same as what we would identify as play, recreation, and leisure.
I love that point, Chris, right? So, and I think that's a really important understanding for all of us as youth advocates. Is that just because it doesn't look like what was familiar to you doesn't mean it doesn't have those characteristics of joy and autonomy and self-determination. And as Dr. Caldwell saying, that it's critically important for positive development. And so Dr. Caldwell, Linda, your experience is from both your work here in the United States, but also from your work overseas. So we know that you were in Iceland and South Africa, and most recently in Portugal. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of play and what commonalities and potential differences you've seen in what play and the culture of play looks like between what happens here in the United States and in other countries?
Sure, thanks for asking that. And this is a really hard question for me to answer, and an easy one. So here we go, on this hand and on that hand again. But I think, the cultural norms and practices obviously have an influence on what it looks like, but all people love to have fun. I mean, that's just, fun, joy you were talking about. I often forget to talk about fun and joy because that seems so central to me, to leisure and fun, but it really does look very similar across the world. However, fundamentally, I think the sense of freedom, and this is a relative sense of freedom, depending on where you are in the world, that a relative sense of freedom and autonomy, given the context and the norms of where somebody's from, it really common elements of play across the world. One example comes to mind that I think illustrates the needs for parents and caregivers in society at large to understand the developmental importance of play in adolescence. And this may or may not be relevant, but I had the opportunity years and years ago. I was at Penn State, and two Togolese doctoral students asked me to help them do a study in Togo, which is a small country between Ghana and Benin. So and this was a needs assessment of youth in a small, very rural village, no running water, nothing like that. So we conducted a series of focus groups with village stakeholders. One of the things we wanted to know what youth do in their free time, and because there's so much out of the community migration, they were leaving the community in droves. One of the focus groups that we did consisted of primarily shopkeepers and merchants who were primarily, I think they were all men actually. And at first they just were, no, there is no use for recreation and play. These teenagers, they need to do their chores. They need to learn that free time and play is no good. But the interesting thing is they started talking among themselves. And all of a sudden, somebody would say, well, I think they start learning things, or they start learning how to solve problems, or they start learning how to be creative. And I say that example because I think those of us who are trying to promote how important recreation, leisure, and play are, sometimes it's an easy sell and sometimes it's not an easy sell because people don't know how important this is and why we should pay attention, why we should give money to services in these environments. So I just thought that was maybe an interesting example of how people can actually come to it, but they need a little help getting there.
Thanks. And I really do love that sometimes it's an easy sell and sometimes it's a hard sell. So for those of us who are advocating on behalf of young people in the legal system, it's often a hard sell. There is not any emphasis on young people having this developmental experience of recreation and leisure in the context of what the court system expects of them. So thank you for sharing that. But also, Dr. Caldwell, in the international context, many other countries have really strengthened what they believe is right in terms of a young people's access to play and right to play. Can you talk a little bit about the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and other things you've learned from the World Leisure Organization about other perspectives on play and how important it is?
Sure, and if I may, just first, while you were asking that question, it's been fascinating to me, and most of my research has been done in South Africa. The reason that I mean, I'm going to get contacted from people all across the world. Can I use this? Can I do this? What do you think about this? What do you think about that? It is easier, I think, in the rest of the world than it is in the United States to get people to understand how important this is. And doing research in South Africa or Malaysia or China or Iceland has been so much easier because people are fundamentally getting how important this is, where it's so much more difficult in the United States. So having said that, the United Nations have the committee, I'm going to read a little bit of this because I can't just spout it off. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has defined play as any behavior, activity, or process initiated, controlled, and structured by children themselves. It takes place wherever and whenever and wherever opportunities arise. Play involves the exercise of autonomy, physical, mental, or emotional activity, and has the potential to take infinite forms. We've been through this, right? Either in groups or alone. These forms will change and be adapted through the course of a childhood. The committee defines recreation as a very broad range of activities chosen voluntarily by the child because he or she perceives some personal or social value in participation. The reason I love this is because they're right. I don't need to tell them that, but this is wonderful that there's this, the United Nations understands the universal right of the child to play. And in response to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in 1952, the World Leisure Association was formed as a worldwide non-governmental organization recognized by the United Nations, dedicated to discovering and fostering those conditions best permitting leisure to serve as a force for growth, human growth, development, and well-being. And I've been involved with World Leisure for a really, really long time. And one thing you might be interested in is just recently they've started this youth ambassador program. And we did a webinar training for them about how to develop programs and how to help communities where these youth ambassadors live develop recreation programs that are appropriate for the area. So to me, it's just so exciting that this really is a worldwide value.
Thanks so much, Linda. I really appreciate that. And, it's striking to me that the World Leisure Organization was established in 1952 and that yet today in 2023, this nation still has such a hard time understanding, accepting, and appreciating how important this is developmentally for young people. And Chris, before I turn back to Dr. Caldwell, this is really challenging in this country. Why?
It's a really great question. I wish I had an answer. I think the way I think about it is, one, people who have it take it for granted, right? So folks who are wealthy, educated, have free time, all of that, take it for granted. And then, people of color or folks who are indigent have less opportunity. It's consistent with whatever else we see in terms of structural racism, wealth gap, all of the barriers that we see are at play in the disparate access to play. I also, now that I'm thinking about it and talking about it out loud, it's also the historical, differences in the ways in which Black and Brown youth of color have been excluded from places like parks, recreation, libraries, which are a source of leisure, swimming pools, for sure, all of that.
Thanks so much, Chris. And, I think we all see that in our work, how much young people that we work with are excluded from these opportunities. And as Chris said, it's really different. Based on who you are. And unfortunately, in the culture of this country, the structures of racism so impede and impact a young person's ability to have that freedom, that liberty that Dr. Caldwell is talking about. So, we have a general awareness about the importance of play, recreation, and leisure for young people. I want to now dive in with you, Linda, to the particular impacts of play, recreation, and leisure in the lives of young people. We know the research supports play, recreation, and leisure for very young people, but we don't often hear a lot of discussion about the critical nature of play, recreation, and leisure for teenagers, adolescents, the young people that we work with in the legal system. And I always remember the quote that I love from Dr. Larry Steinberg is that adolescence is the last best opportunity we have to promote positive, healthy development for young people. And the fact that we haven't really dug into an understanding of what this means developmentally for young people is kind of astounding, right? It is so essential. It shouldn't be so hard in this nation for us to make sense of this and make it happen. So let's just start to unpack a few developmental pieces. So let's start with physical development. So we know there's a lot going on in brains and bodies of teenagers. Can you talk a little bit about the physical benefits of play to teenagers?
Sure, certainly. And actually, this is a pretty easy one because to me, it just makes sense. Excuse me. You know, when we move our bodies, we get physical benefits. And we also get mental benefits. I mean, doing healthy physical activity it produces all sorts of good stuff in the body and helps with cardiovascular issues and sets the stage for healthy adult activity, healthy bones, muscular development, learning, excuse me again, learning how to move your body as you're an adolescent because you're really awkward and you have to figure out how to control your body. I mean, those are all really important things that I think that seem just like self-evident to me, but I think maybe I shouldn't be so cavalier about it. But also, you know, people have found that physical activity is also associated with increased self-esteem, good self-awareness. On the other hand, you know, there are all sorts of body issues that are associated with recreation and leisure, that recreation and leisure can promote good body image or be potentially detrimental to that. So I think we also have to bring that in. Also, as I'm sure you all know, Black and Brown communities are notoriously lacking in opportunities or healthy physical activities. I had been doing a study with a former student of mine who's now in California, working with Latinx grandparents and their grandchildren to promote healthy activity and what the issues are of getting, you know, the parents want to say one thing and the grandparents say another and the kids. And so I just think it's a very complex issue, but it's critically important.
Thanks, Linda. So, you know, I think we all understand the physical importance developmentally of play. And we recognize, of course, for teenagers, how important it is for them to have healthy spaces to move their bodies and be active. But we also, you know, Linda, we all talk about healthy body, healthy mind. Can you talk about the importance of play for cognitive development and brain development for young people?
Yeah, I think this is also a really good sell for people. And there are a lot of studies out there really that link participation in organized activities with academic achievement. So I think those are some important things to recognize that research has shown us. To me, I think in simple terms, the leisure context, I always slip to leisure context because that's what I think, that play, recreation, leisure. I'll just slip to leisure sometimes. But the leisure context, I think, is really, really uniquely situated to promote brain development because it helps youth develop their passions, learn socio-emotional regulation in a social context, and to prevent, which is what I like working on, is prevent unsafe, risky behaviors. But it also is a context for risky behaviors as well. I think that the play creates opportunities to practice and improve on executive functioning skills, you know, good decision-making, critical reflection, problem solving. If you think of kids on a basketball court, when it happens in a social context, kids learn how to regulate themselves. You were talking about Reed as ice. So kids are out there hanging, having fun, and they're having to self-regulate themselves. There's this great, excuse me again, I got something in my throat. There's this great video that was done years and years and years ago. It was called 2 Ball Games. And I think it's even in black and white. I don't even know if you can get it anymore. But what the author of this 2 Ball Games did was documented. Here's one ball game with Little League, and here's another ball game. It's the pickup game. And the Little League game was so overstructured. The kids were standing out there. They were bored. You know, the adults were fighting among themselves. The kids just didn't really seem to be in it. There was no problem solving. And then the unstructured ball game, the kids were clearly having more fun. I mean, they meant it to be this way, but they were clearly having more fun. The ball went into the gutter in the drain, and the kids had to figure out how to get the ball out. So, I think sometimes we think structured and organized is better than unstructured. And I would never make that argument necessarily, but I think that, what was better developmentally and for their brains, which ball game. And I always come back to the second ball game, of course. Let's see, what else do I want to say? Oh, another thing in terms of brain development sort of fits here is identity development. That's such a critical thing for adolescents is, who am I? And you all know this. Who am I? Who am I in this world? Who am I in connection to the people around me? Who am I? Who do I want to be? And I think that the leisure context, which is often called the fourth developmental context, aside from work, school, and family, but the leisure context, the fourth developmental context, really is one because it's supposedly free and autonomy supportive. The developmental benefits are just really reaped, and that's why it's so important to understand the brain development at this time.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask Chris to jump in.
Yeah, just listening to you again, Linda, I just love all of these thoughts. It's making connections for me. As I was listening, I immediately thought of the case that many people maybe who are listening will recall, the Bridgewater Mall in New Jersey, where the young boy got into a fight. There's a group of kids doing what kids do. They hang out in large groups at the mall. One kid starts bullying another kid, and Zakai jumps in. He's a teenager who jumps in to stop the bullying, to intervene on behalf of another kid who's bullying. And so I'm thinking about all of the cognitive and other developmental benefits, right? You talked about social skills, identity development, value setting, all of that. And also the ways in which we learn self-regulation. Well, the kid who was doing the bullying is now, right, going to have some internal self-reflection, accountability about what does it mean to bully another kid. And we could talk later about how Zakai, the one who jumped in to break up or to stop the bullying, ended up being criminalized. But I love this idea that this unstructured time, this social time that actually may appear to be a nuisance to many people, is actually really important as young people think about who they are and become, ultimately young, responsible, civilians in our society.
So go ahead, Linda.
Can I just jump in there? I think, we can maybe come to this later, but I think, to me, again, this gets to the importance of unstructured play and structured play, organized. And certainly there are not enough opportunities in many of the communities that you're in. And there need to be more organized activities because they're so important, but they're not the only important thing. So that's just the point that I want to make, is that too much structure, look, the kids, I worry about my nephew and niece's kids. They're structured all the time. What are they going to do when they're faced with unstructured time? What are they going to do when they get to college? Let's say they go to college, who knows, that they have to. So there really is a balance here. And I always get a little testy when I say, well, there has to be both structured and unstructured. So there, I've said my piece.
So one of the things about structured and unstructured activities, they both can incorporate some element of risk taking. And so those of us who are youth defense advocates, and all of us who are parents, and all of us who have children that we love, have experienced young people taking risks. And so in the chat right now, we'd like to invite you to just put very brief examples of some sensation-seeking activity that a young person you represented or a young person you love engaged in, just to get us thinking about risk-taking. And I'll share one from my father-in-law. When he was a young person in upstate New York, they used to go tobogganing in the winter down a hill, and they would take full axes with them as they were racing down the hill and challenge each other to throw those axes at trees in front of them in the cross path of the person they were racing. That was their activity. Now, they lived to tell the story, but every time he tells that story, I just think about, the incredible risks and why that was fun in upstate New York to throw axes at each other while they were tobogganing. So if you want to put some short examples of risk-taking, sensation-seeking activity in the chat, that would be very helpful as we turn to Linda to talk a little bit about risky behavior and how important that is, both in terms of our cognitive development, but also how critical it is to development, period.
Sure. I think probably many of you are familiar with the brain. The brain develops differently across adolescence, and the two systems. The cognitive control system develops later than the socio-emotional system. And so Gault and a lot of people talk about the brakes aren't there. So you're in an emotional situation and the amygdala is firing and there's no brakes to put it on. So that's a very simplistic way of looking at why risk might happen. And we also, I think, know that for younger kids, if it's a socially laden, some people call it a hot situation, right? That you're more likely to need to take a risk. But there's also the idea of sensation seeking and impulsivity, and they all mean something a little bit different from each other. And we're not going to go into that now. I'm certainly not an expert in that area. But when I was thinking about this question, one of the things that I thought might be important for us to think about is that what is risk to an adolescent versus what is risk to an adult? And I think most of us think about risk as an adult might define risk. And maybe that's not the way a young person thinks about risk. And I've read this, I didn't do this myself, but it's really possible that adolescents aren't really trying to take a risk in the risk-reward perspective, but maybe they're just doing what adolescents do and they're exploring and experimenting. So they don't even think what they're doing is risky. They're just having fun. Or maybe the decision to take a risk, if an adolescent knows what the possible outcomes are, he or she may not be as likely to take that risk if they think of the possible outcomes, whereas they don't know what the outcomes are, maybe they're just going to explore a little bit. If an adolescent's tolerance for ambiguity is higher tolerance, if they have a higher tolerance for ambiguity, so they don't know what the result's going to be or can think of what the possible outcomes might be, they're okay with it. They're just going to try to do whatever they're doing. So I think it would behoove us also to understand what they're thinking and why they're doing what they're doing. If we label it risky behavior, maybe we just need to better understand that perspective. I don't know about that. But also, I think that's really important is that risk-taking is not always negative. And in fact, especially in a leisure situation, well, a healthy leisure situation, it can be really developmentally productive. If the positive risk is that something beneficial might happen and the costs are mild and they're outweighed by the benefits and they're legal and socially acceptable, positive risk is a time where they can push themselves a little bit to become who they are or learn more about themselves or practice a skill, or if they're in a supportive environment. I remember once I was in a rock, I was trying to learn rappelling in a rock climbing situation, and I was scared to death and I didn't want to do it. And everybody, come on, Linda, come on, do it. And I did it. And I was so excited. So, that was I learned a lot, self-esteem, and I could do it. And I had friends who would help me and all that kind of stuff. So I think, and this could be anything. This could be having a kid who wants to start a recreation program, standing up before city council and giving a presentation is why that's so important, and having the support around that kid. That's a positive risk, you know. So anyhow, Reed Larson has done so much work in this area, and he talks about this as one of experiencing dissonance, which activates the need to learn to adapt, overcome challenges, persist, and respond to environmental feedback. Sort of like things don't always go as planned. Okay, pick yourself up and try it out, and you've learned something from it. And that process leads to self-efficacy, learning confidence, and you then become more intrinsically motivated.
Wonderful. So, and it's a question / comment in the chat. Doesn't it actually feel more pleasurable to young people when they take risks? It is a pleasure-seeking activity, and that emotional arousal is very satisfying.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think the emotional arousal can be very satisfying until then it becomes too much. So there's probably a point where then, and you know, when it becomes too much for an adolescent, how will that adolescent respond? Pull back or push forward? And that push forward might look like something that's not a healthy activity to be doing. So yeah, I definitely think that's all that to understand about sensation seeking and risk and reward and just risk taking in general.
Great, thanks. And so I think it's just so important for us to just hone into this fact that risk taking is not inherently a negative thing, right? It's something we're supposed to do. Developmentally, it's really important for young people to have those contexts where they can take risks, learn from them, and be autonomous. So we now have heard about the physical impacts, our cognitive impacts. Linda, we have to imagine that play, recreation, and leisure also impact a young person's mental health. Can you talk about the mental health impacts, please?
I will. Thank you. I'm just going to jump back because I wanted to say something and I forgot to say it, is that there's the whole other thing about brain development that people have written about is that adolescence is a time where kids can ignite their passions. And so that's why it's really important for us to support what they're doing too. And I just love that term. And it's really because of what's happening in the brain that they are ready and wanting to learn something and find that spark. So whatever it is, my grandnephew is going to be a fisher person, or, you know, what is it? Is it art or is it music? And how wonderful it is when adolescents are in supportive environments that help them figure out what that passion might be. Even schools these days are having, I'm working with some schools in Vermont, and they have Friday passion days, you know, and just what they're going to allow the kids to do. There's like 200 clubs that they can join on a Friday to find out what they like to do. And that's perfect because that's taking advantage of that brain development that's ready to do. So, okay, that off of that, then I just, the mental health issue, oh my goodness, is so important for all of us now, right? It's there's been so much about leisure and mental health. A lot of it has to do with the stress coping response. Much of the research has shown that the importance of leisure-based social support and being self-determined are really predictors of how to better be able to cope with stress. And some researchers have talked about the stress coping response in sort of 3 categories. One is palliative leisure. So just go out and run or do something immediately to alleviate stress. Go for a walk on the beach. Be physical, tussle around, you know, not get in a fight, but just have some fun. And that offers an immediate psychological escape. Or go read a book or whatever it might be, just something that's palliative for the moment. Another way that leisure serves as a stress coping for increased mental health is they call it mood enhancement. So watch a funny movie, or go hang out in front of Rita's and hang out with your buds, and just have just have a lot of fun. Just let it go. Go watch a movie. And then the other thing is leisure companionship, especially if there's socially supportive companionship. So back to Rita's again, or basketball, or whatever it is. Be with friends who will support you, who go through that stressful situation. We all as adults have that. We know that helps us, and I think it's the same with young people.
Thank you so much. That's so helpful in terms of us being able to really articulate these three really specific aspects of leisure, palliative, mood enhancement, and leisure companionship. Just for us to be able to have that language so that we can use it in our advocacy is just wonderful. So thank you so much for talking about the interplay between mental health and play. We did get a question in the chat that we will see if we have time to get to later. So I'm just going to hold it for now, but just letting you know, if you have other questions, you can also put them in the Q&A. And if we have time, we'll try to get to those at the end of the presentation. So we want to get to one more developmental aspect of play, which is socialization, which you started to talk about already, and which Chris has talked about in this example from young people hanging out at Rita's. Dr. Caldwell, when we think about play, we have to imagine it has an impact on the critically important developmental aspect of socialization. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll just be brief. I know we have time, but I think there are time issues. Excuse me. Well, they learn how to they're learning intimacy and close relationships that aren't family related. They're with their peers, and that's really important. I think they learn some empathetic skills, of course, depending. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is, and this goes a lot to the importance of organized activities and community-based activities, is participate in those kinds of activities, tend to have more bonding to this community or to social structures or community structures. So they develop maybe a social network or connections. I think that many of us who work with young people tried to help with leadership development as well. So giving them leadership opportunities so that they can emerge as leaders and followers, and learning how to be a good follower too. So I just think the socialization and forming bonds with adults that are not caregivers or parents, is having a caring adult in their lives is just so important, as you all know. So
thanks so much for that. So we talk about the critical importance of strong relationships for young people, and the fact that we haven't been talking about play, recreation, and leisure as a method for forming those relationships is really insightful and helpful. So we're going to now move to part 2 of this conversation. So we're going to turn to Professor Henning. We're going to talk to Chris a little bit about the aspects of this as it relates to youth defense and advocacy. So our community, led by Chris in her writing of the book, Rage of Innocence, we've been thinking a lot about how young people are deprived of the opportunity and the fundamental necessity of play throughout their experience in the juvenile legal system, from arrests through conditions of confinement that they're faced. And really, Chris, your book helped us all really start to build this advocacy content and really think about it in the work that we do. So can you talk a little bit today, just give us a refresher on how does the various stages of the legal system impact a young person's ability to access play, recreation, and leisure?
Yeah, I mean, I would say even before they get into the system, right? It's all the things we talk about, the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors. And so like if we start with literally everything that I listed earlier when you asked me what does play look like in an urban environment like DC, hanging out in front of McDonald's and Rita's Ice is considered disorderly. It's considered loitering, right? Incommoding. I don't know if I've ever talked about this one, but incommoding, right? Which is, inciting people to riot, right? By hanging out in front of, a restaurant. Sitting in folding chairs is also disorderly, right? We've already talked about the mall, right? The New Jersey mall, and kids really could work that out for themselves, right? Yes, there was a fight. Yes, it's a nuisance maybe to others, but at the end of the day, it's a fight. You break up the fight. It doesn't have to be criminalized and end itself in court. You've got kids arrested for playing basketball, either because some adult told them don't play here, curfew violations, all of it, right? But I will say this, listening to Linda talk about risk-taking and, so many of the other aspects of, the developmental benefits. And I also started thinking about protest and how extraordinarily valuable it is for a young person to participate in a protest, right? A march, a sit-in, a kneeling, after, Colin Kaepernick, right? Kaepernick was kneeling. All of that is very valuable, challenging the status quo. And there's research, Linda, on the mental health benefits of youth activism. So I just would add, all of that becomes criminalized, though, on the front end. And then once kids get into the system, at the pretrial stage, I immediately start thinking about all the ways in which children are denied the opportunity for recreation and play and leisure, not just in detention facilities, but also pending trial in the community. So electronic monitoring, right? Curfew, stay away orders from friends, stay away orders, I think is really powerful, staying away from friends and family. Also at the trial phase, right? Normal adolescent play is often treated as evidence of criminal intent, right? And the one that immediately pops up for me is an old case. Folks will remember Lionel Tate, right? The child from Florida who was prosecuted, actually convicted and sentenced for wrestling, right? Wrestling with the 6-year-old kid that he was playing with, and the like. So and the question becomes whether he was just playing, i.e. mimicking a wrestler that he had seen on television, or whether it was intentional. So thinking about things like that as a legal question, right? Kids being criminally charged for committing foul in a football game or throwing a basketball in a basketball. I've seen all of these cases. We're not making them up. At the sentencing phase, at the transfer hearing, the ways in which young people, once they're sentenced in adult court, I should say, after they have been transferred, young people who are literally terrified to come out during meal times, to come out during recreation times into the general population, and that's huge, right? So the 1 hour that they get for rec time, they don't want to come out because they're terrified of being assaulted. Youth on probation, experiencing all the concerns that I talked about at the detention phase, as I press through thinking about other conditions of confinement, that 1 hour, right? There are national recommendations from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that all young people get at least 60 minutes a day, which I think is far too low, but of physical activity, right? And then in many youth prisons and jails, they're not even getting that, right? Or only getting it, 2 or 3 days of work a week. And then when they do get time to go outside, outdoors is often on a concrete slab, right? Without any greenery. And maybe even for kids who are in solitary confinement, at best, you're by yourself. And really, I was thinking again about Linda's thoughts about, or the link between mental health and physical activity, but how kids in solitary confinement are more likely, increased risk of suicide, self-mutilation, all of those things are directly tied to the deprivation of play.
Thanks, Chris. So Linda, as someone who has worked in the play, recreation, and leisure space for your career, and now engaging with us in this context, I can imagine you have a lot of thoughts about how this system and many systems and structures across this country have denied young people opportunities for access to play. And we know that there's research about how play, recreation, and leisure give young people the opportunity to really prevent engagement in any behavior that should be or could be criminalized. So could you talk a little bit about what you, based on what you heard from Chris and also the work that you've done, what you have learned about the connection between what we label delinquency and play?
Well, what I know, again, to reiterate a former point that I made, is that leisure really is a context for risk and prevention. And I come to the prevention side of things, so trying to prevent these through our leisure ed programs. But it's just so important, because I think you probably all know that most of the crimes that are committed by and against children happen after school in their so-called free time. So the time slot is usually 3 to 6 p.m. is the peak time for children to be involved in delinquency. And this is important as well, because, it's been estimated in the United States, at least, is that overall, most American youth have about 40% of their time is free time. And people might be disputing that now, but that's a whole lot of time. If it's concentrated in this 3 to 6 period, that's an issue, but it's also a point where prevention can take place as well. There was a survey in 2006, which I found really interesting. This was a survey of more than 600 12 and 17-year-old kids in California. They found that those who were left unsupervised, latchkey kids, 3 or more days a week, were twice as likely to hang out with gang members. Well, that doesn't surprise me, but it's a big number. And it's important to know 3 times as likely to be engaged in criminal behavior, and more than 3 times as likely to use illegal drugs. My own work has been formed a lot around leisure, boredom and leisure, which seems like a really crazy concept, because if you're doing something you want to and you're supposed to be doing it, how is it bored? How is it being bored? But obviously it's not a positive leisure experience. So there's a mismatch of desires and what you're experiencing. But often being bored occurs in a so-called, what you call a leisure experience. And youth who are more bored or unengaged or uninvolved are at higher risk of negative behaviors and delinquency. Work in South Africa was very clear on this. One of the studies we did was a 5-year study, and we looked at kids starting in the 8th grade, and we measured beginning of school and after school, beginning of 8th, end of 8th, beginning of 9th, end of 9th, beginning of 10th, end of 10th, beginning of 11th. And so we could look at developmental trajectories. And what we found is that if a kid in 8th grade reported that I have a low level of boredom on a 1 to 5 scale, I'm not that bored, things are fine. And then that same child at the beginning of 10th grade reported a significantly increased experience of boredom in their leisure, they were much more likely to be higher use of substances and co-occurring sexual behavior as well. So that's just a snapshot of the kinds of things that I think we have to be really aware in terms of, delinquent behavior. And some people have talked about trying to understand the relationship between leisure time and delinquency. They call one the filled time perspective. And I mean, it's pretty simplistic, but it makes some sense. If this time, between 3 and 6 p.m., let's call it like an after school time, is filled with pro-social activities, then it can't be filled with deviant activities. Mixed. Or the association with deviant peers perspective. That is, the more you're around your deviant peers, the more deviant you're going to become. And then there's the person environment interaction perspective. How activities are structured and organized is really critical. I also think that it's really important to know about the environment, and Chris noted this briefly, but I think that the environment, whether it's built or natural, is really important. I think that natural spaces is really important. Is it attractive? What is safety issues around it? And to that, perhaps if we have time. And then there's this last perspective that's called the activity structure perspective, which is time spent in informal or unsupervised activities is likely to promote deviance, while time spent in supervised activities protects against it. And this is again where I come in, and yes, I agree with that, but I also disagree with that. And there's been a lot of research around it, but you have to, when you're reading this research, you have to dig deeper, because there's a group of researchers who absolutely are right on when they suggest that organized structured activities are developmentally productive and can prevent risky behaviors. I totally agree. But then there's others who report that participation in organized this is still the same. Organized activities are less likely to engage in criminal behavior. Then there's a group of researchers, Mahoney and other people, who only focus on recreation centers that are not well run and that just have unstructured activities. And so, of course, those kids are going to be more likely to participate in deviant behavior. My only point is that it just depends on how well the after school or the community organization is structured, whether or not you'll get the benefits. Or if it's overstructured, they won't get the benefits. So back to that 2 ball games kind of thing. So to me, it's just not as easy to say structure is good and unstructured is bad.
So Linda, for us, as advocates, so we know there's a lot of conversations about young people and how they spend their time, but as advocates, we really want to be able to lift up what young people say is beneficial to them in terms of their free time. And we want to be able to back that up with research. So how do we, in our advocacy with young people, advocate for components of effective programs? So you spend a lot of time looking at out of school time. Can you give us some pointers? How do we talk about out of school time in a positive way that supports what young people say they want, and that we can back up by some research?
Well, first thing I'll say is that what young people want, that is critical. So they have to have an authentic voice in making this happen. It's not a, if you build it, they will come kind of thing. There have been so many failed municipal recreation programs because here, I think the youth would like this, or I think people would like that. So here's a program, and here's the list of the programs. That ain't going to work. And especially consider, we were talking about adolescent development and how autonomy and decision-making is so important. They need to learn decision-making skills. They need to be structured. There's a scaffolding. People in development call it the scaffolding approach, where depending on the skills of the kids to make decisions, the adults help them until they can make more, and they can make more, and they can make more. Failure's okay. Let's learn from it and pick ourselves up and go again. But I really think the importance is having the kids' authentic voice. I also think the environment, again, has to be a attractive environment. Kids have to feel safe psychologically, safe from violence. They have to feel safe with the adult leaders who are there. They have to feel safe with the people who are there. I think that the National Academies of Science identified 8 features of positive youth development programs. which are right on target. And I just mentioned the physical and psychological safety, and the structure has to be developmentally appropriate. So again, that means that kids have to have a voice, and their voice has to be heard. And it's not just how many people want to do this and how many people want to do that, but it's actually, let's think about this. Let's think through the consequences. What would really work in the environment? What would really work here? How do we make it happen? Bring them in as supportive relationships through adults, the opportunity to belong. And again, that's, read as ice is one thing, but this is where a community structure can do a better job, is giving, I belong to this, whatever, I belong, I'm an important person, and I'm valued in this environment. Setting standards, and have the kids help set the standards. What are the norms that we're going to deal with in this? This is something I'm sure you all know. And then having them have opportunities that they actually do something that matters and that they feel good about. They're doing this, learning skills, and to the extent possible, integrating families and schools and communities. But that's challenging, but that's certainly one of the principles that I think are really an important principle.
Thanks so much for that, Linda. So critically, of course, for all of us is that young people have to have a voice in designing what their play, recreation, leisure looks like. And, we face a lot of challenges with this as youth advocates, because we hear you talking about this idea of young people having to feel safe and then promoting safe spaces. And that's not always available to the young people who we're defending. And Chris, there's a lot of reasons for that in our communities. So we as advocates have to figure out how to ensure that we're helping the courts understand that it's not the young person's fault that this is not available in their community, and therefore they shouldn't be punished for it. But Chris, what's some of the history of this? So, we want to, as defenders, be able to think about making sure that young people we defend have access to these programs. But why having young people we defend have they not had access to some of the types of programming Linda's describing?
Yeah, just even as I listen to you ask the question, I am reminded of standing in front of judges who, often give preference, right, in terms of detention release questions, disposition questions, to those kids who can demonstrate they're involved in a range of extracurricular activities, or that they're excelling at arts and, whatever, after school clubs. I think, Linda mentioned things of that nature, and, forgetting that many of our clients don't have access to those, both either historically or just contemporarily based on opportunities in their schools and in their communities. So historically, we've already mentioned this actually earlier, we all know we live in a country in which many young people of color have been denied access to critical places of leisure. We talked about libraries, parks, swimming pools, again, summer camps, right? National parks, right? We're segregated, at the outset. And then even today, you feel the impacts of that discrimination. People of color today are 3 times more likely than white people to live in places with no immediate access to nature. Dr. Caldwell talked about nature, right? Parks in non-white areas are often half the size of those in majority white spaces. 64% of African-American children cannot swim, compared to 45% of Hispanic children using the language from the study, and 40% of white children, right? Also, even when libraries, parks, swimming pools are open, even today, to youth of color, they're more likely to be under-resourced in comparison to pools and libraries and parks in white spaces. And I have to say, I know this was mentioned earlier, for anyone on this call who missed the first play webinar that we did last year, and it's already been, I believe, dropped in the chat. Yes, I know it's been dropped in the chat. Dr. Harrison Pinckney and Dr. Razul Moat talk about some of this history, and they've got great research and readings on that. It's really important for us. Marianne, you talked about educating, our community, our juvenile legal community. Just other quickly, community, or I should say contributing factors that I think of course, I think I've already mentioned the wealth gap, right? Less disposable income in many families and communities of color means less money to spend on some of the resources. And I think about, like you all listing in the chat, soccer, football, even me with skating, all of that stuff costs money, right? Can my kids even go fishing? Maybe it's a little less expensive, but the fancy rods and and all of that stuff is expensive, and you got to have time away from work to be able to do that. But also this notion, I want to come back to this notion, Linda, you keep talking about feeling safe, right? That youth of color disproportionately live in neighborhoods where they don't feel safe. So they don't want to go outside and play. They attend schools, many of our children, our clients attend schools where they have cut recess, arts classes, other elective programs. Kids of color who are disproportionately disciplined in school, right, are often excluded. I can tell you my opening story in The Rage of Innocence. As a kid who brought, accused of bringing a Molotov cocktail to school when it was absolutely just play, and it had no ability to catch fire and be at all a Molotov cocktail. He was excluded from his drama classes, right, as a result of that criminalization. And that was critically important for my particular client, Eric, that I talk about in the book. And then just, a couple of more, kids. Oh, I love thinking about this, the ways in which our kids are traumatized, right, by over policing and hyper surveillance in the community means, right, not only do I feel unsafe because I live in a particularly maybe, a neighborhood that has got higher rates of violence, but also because I'm afraid to encounter the police, when I walk out. And I tell a number of stories of kids, one kid in particular sitting, looking outside his window, sees a police car and waits, for 2 hours because he won't go outside because he's afraid that the police are outside waiting for him. So, this is all about not feeling safe to go and play.
And Chris, so connected to this, right? So we know structures of racism are preventing young people from having access to play. And, compounding that is implicit racial bias and young people's encounters with law enforcement today. So can you just talk for just quickly, I know we have talked about this a lot in the other chapters, about the impact of bias on play?
Absolutely. I mean, folks who've been on any of our webinars, we always make sure to at least remind folks that there is up-to-date research on implicit racial bias and the ways in which that bias has a unique impact on the perceptions of adolescents. And as we're talking about adolescent play, Black boys being perceived as older, more than 4.5 years older than they actually are, meaning that we're more likely to treat as some normal adolescent play, like Tamir Rice playing with a toy gun, as violent and dangerous. Similar research involving Black girls, we know, from Georgetown's Poverty Institute, talking about the ways in which Black girls are perceived to be older, more mature, more knowledgeable than they actually are. That has a lot to do with sexual, alleged and purported sexual offending, right? The ways in which just normal adolescent communication, right, with a romantic and common appropriate romantic interest gets treated as sexualized. Young Black males perceived to be stronger, more muscular than they actually are, means that their normal adolescent play, kickball, throwing a basketball, having a foul in a football game is perceived as threatening and dangerous. So, I mean, the research goes on, and we have dropped in the chat, thank you, Alina, our implicit racial bias studies that we keep up to date on how this research impacts the perceptions of adolescents among Black and brown youth.
Thanks so much for that, Chris. So we've got structural racism, implicit racial bias, and so many young people who've had their lives taken away or harmed so dramatically because these structures have really impacted their attempts to play, their opportunities for recreation and leisure. And, we see that in Trayvon Martin's experience at 17 years old, walking down the street, Trayman McMillan at 14 years old was playing on the beach with his puppy and a dog. And, the cops take him down and put him in a chokehold. Tamir Rice, of course, who lost his life playing in a park. All the young people who were harmed at the bikini pool party. And they were just, teenagers at a birthday party, having fun. Law enforcement made them so fearful. And the impact that's had, the ripple effect that's had on young people all across our country. So we're going to take a moment to watch a very brief video clip of the real impact these experiences have had on young people in Black and Latino and Indigenous communities today. So let's watch together.
Tonight we're hearing from the father of this 9-year-old in Connecticut who was playing ball outside of his home when he hid from a passing police car. And the reason he gave is heartbreaking. Eyewitness News reporter Kimberly Richardson has the story.
You didn't think much of it, right? Obviously.
Of course not. Just watching him shoot some hoops and he was making his shots. I was super proud of him.
Of his 9-year-old son, Elia, who on a warm summer day in Trumbull, Connecticut, was simply being a kid. But then the family's home security system caught a heartbreaking image, the soon-to-be 5th grader reacting as a police car drives by.
When I got home, I asked him why he did what he did, and then he goes on to tell me because they killed George Floyd. So that leveled me. What do you say to that?
Right there, the camera shows Elia briefly hiding behind an SUV, barely moving an inch until the police car passes. It's only then that he goes back to playing ball. Stacy Pierre Lewis was at work watching the system remotely, got a notification there was motion in the garage. Never imagined he'd see this.
You feel, sadness, you feel shock, even a sense of hopelessness I felt personally, just because I wasn't there to make him feel better.
The married father of 2 waited a few days before posting the video on social media. Millions have viewed the clip. LA legend LeBron James saying, "Breaks my heart," then writing a letter to the family.
Ultimately, I'm grateful this happened because it sets up an environment where you can have these sometimes uncomfortable but very necessary conversations with not, just our kid, but, everyone.
Stacy tells me since he posted that video, he's received overwhelmingly positive comments and feedback. Shortly after this happened, a police officer.
So that clip just brings home how this culture of surveillance and criminalization of young people, especially Black and Latino and Indigenous young people, has created a culture where a young boy doesn't even feel safe to play basketball in his driveway at home. Chris, what do these experiences and the many that you've had with clients over the years say to you about the culture of play in this country, and how does it impact your work with as a defender of young people?
Yeah, look, it's pretty clear that play has become a source of trauma instead of a source of relief for so many, youth of color. It's just really, really disturbing. I just think that video is a perfect example of that. Youth who grow up being systematically denied access to recreation and play in their own yards. This is what I was talking about. This idea of kids sitting out. This was his home, right? Sitting out or playing in the driveway basketball. My kids who live in apartment buildings or public housing, sitting out. The only place they have when it's hot and it's steamy and you need that moment away from your siblings or from your parents. You do what all of us did when we were kids. You go outside, and that is just not a safe place. Why? Because they're afraid of the police driving by. And what does that mean? And so I think, it's just such a vicious cycle when you really play it out, right? If play is criminalized, then it leads to more fear and stress, right? And you have to feel safe to be able to play. So it's really ridiculous, right? Yet ironically, play could help you feel safer because it would allow you to feel less stress, but there's no outlet. right? So that was a little contorted, but the whole point is it's just such a conundrum, right? That I don't think we pay enough attention to. And then, you ask, what do we as defenders and advocates? I think that's what this work is all about, Marianne, like this idea of taking the research that, we stumbled upon, to be quite frank, in our thinking, in my own reflections, for example, about how my kids that I represent were being impacted as I begin to stumble upon it. How can I apply that research back to my advocacy? So it is litigation, litigating some forms of play or the right to play or access to play at all stages of the continuum. It's actually asking our clients about opportunities for access to play, recreation, leisure. It's about participating in systemic reform. And, we can break all that down, given, how time flows.
Thanks, Chris. And, similarly, Linda, in terms of the culture and its impact on young people's access to play, like, what do you say to us as youth defenders? What are we to do? How do we use what you've done in a helpful way?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, and I honestly wish I knew. I just want to scream. I honestly don't know. And I mean, the culture of play is so different depending on where you live and what color you are and, what resources there are. I guess, how do you guys, I mean, this is great training and educational session, but how do you educate police officers and judicial system? Are there opportunities to do that? I guess I'm going to throw it back because I really don't know.
Yeah, and so that's really what this webinar is all about, right? So it's us listening to experts like yourself, learning about what the elements are to create spaces where young people have voiced their interest in play, and just, having experts like you say that so that the courts can gain an understanding of how critically important it is for us to hear from young people about what they need to have access to this developmentally essential element of their growth. So we're going to turn it now to really address this question. And we're really going to roll up our sleeves. How do we do this? So we have a lot of information about the impact of play on development across the arenas. What could we do when young people enter the legal system, and how can we as advocates increase young people's access to play? So, Chris, we're going to walk through the process of a young person's engagement in the legal system and just brainstorm with you about how we could incorporate the research Linda's talked about and aspects of play into our advocacy. So starting at the pretrial stage, how do we incorporate this into our defense?
So when I think about, I guess, the front end of the system, I'm thinking immediately about interviewing, investigation, discovery, right? And so, I talked about this a little bit, like engaging our clients on the interviewing front around these questions, right? So I started thinking about, well, what would those questions look like? And so, I'm not using big words like recreation, leisure, and play, but I might ask the question, what's your favorite thing to do with your friends, right? Or name your top 5 favorite songs. Where do you listen to your music most often? Where do you spend most of your downtime, right? Is it, in your home with your family, or is it outside? And if it's outside, where, right? And I find like a lot of kids, like, I keep talking about the reader's ice and McDonald's. I cannot tell you the number of cases, that I have litigated or represented kids who've been litigated. I'm like, what's up with the reader's ice? Tell me about it. They were like, oh, it's on the way home, right? Like it's literally like between the school and the bus stop, right? And so everybody stops there on the way. So understanding that your client's neighborhood, right? Going out, walking it, figuring out what that looks like, asking your client, if I could go anywhere on a Friday night, where would that place be? And then as I begin to investigate, I also want to ask questions, both of my client and other people. What are the barriers to all of the things that they just said they like to do. So like, what are the barriers to hanging out in the local park? Or what are your barriers to hanging out in front of the local Rita's Ice? Like, again, thinking about my word choice, but who's there? Do they let you play? Do they stop you from playing? And I often get from my clients, well, if there are too many of us, and if we're too loud, for laughing too loud, then, the police will come, and they always come with the bullhorn, break it up. And you're like, why, right? Why? We're not doing anything. So understanding what that's like, maybe also asking our clients some of the questions. We talk about the mental health aspect, right? What does that feel like when the police officers show up? What are you thinking? What are you worried about? So those kinds of questions. And then I think, discovery is similar, right? Maybe either it's investigation as a FOIA request, or it's a discovery request, the number of arrests at that particular location and for what offenses, right? So I'm beginning to lay the foundation for some of that kind of work.
So I love all that. So really specific questions we can be asking young people about their experiences with their free time, and also our own collection of data, really understanding better about how young people's play and leisure is getting interrupted by surveillance. Like, what really is happening? How often are police rolling up in front of Rita's Ice? And for us to get that context so that we could share it with the court. Linda, any specific questions you can suggest we ask our clients about their free time?
How did you know what I was thinking? Yeah, I was, one of the things that we do in our leisure education program, trying to help young people and sometimes parents hone down on what is important about leisure and recreation. And so we to them. And so we say, well, what kind of benefits are you getting? And we don't do this whole big laundry list of anything, but we break it down. And it's like, well, what social benefits are you getting? What physical benefits, what mental benefits, what spiritual benefits, what community benefits, and make it really easy and try to help them identify what it is they get and why they're getting these benefits. And could they get these benefits by something else? Or just having them actually do some thinking about why they're doing what they're doing. And would there be someplace else? I'm not suggesting they don't do Rita's Ice whatsoever, but just trying to understand from them, are they getting, and maybe helping them understand that they could be getting a lot of different benefits, and everybody should get a lot of benefits from what they do. It's not just social or just one thing. I don't know if that would be helpful at all. It was just something that I was thinking about.
Yeah, no, I love that. So really trying to understand from young people that we work with, helping them do some self-assessment on how they feel about that free time. And I love those spheres, socially, spiritually, emotionally, and really unpacking that with young people. I love that self-reflection aspect of our ability to engage and interview our clients. So thank you for those. All right, so Chris, there's a lot here, motions practice. I can imagine there's an awful lot we could do with that.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, thinking about motions at every stage of the case. So, detention, right? Pretrial detention is absolutely, we know, antithetical to play. There's no autonomy, no creativity, no opportunity to play. So can we, file our motions to reduce detention, incorporating the research on developmental benefits of play, right? I love that. And we have started doing that thanks to the research from Dr. Caldwell, Dr. Pinckney, Dr. Mowat, others, and our colleagues, have we at Georgetown and Gault have worked together to draft motions in that vein, really incorporating and talking about the harms of detention with a new lens. I think we've been talking about the harms of detention for a while. I'm not sure any of that early literature on the harms of detention included the developmental denial of play. So that's just a new area to add. But then I would, obviously motions to lift or to remove electronic monitoring, to lift curfew, to lift stayaways. And I think some of us maybe intuitively have been making these arguments. I can remember standing in front of court and arguing to the judge that, like, you know what, Your Honor, I understand the natural instinct to order a stay away from the friend with whom you engaged in delinquent behavior, but guess what? They eventually got to be together. So how about we teach both of them, right? How to, like, make, better decisions over time and not impose the stay away. And that socialization is actually really, really important. So, but now we have, I think, for me, it's new, having some of this developmental research to put behind that argument, I think is useful. I think, at motions practice, I think about Fourth Amendment motions, right? And arguing about the ways in which routine stops and frisks of many of our clients also is an impediment and a significant barrier to play when kids are at parks. Kids are hanging out where they're supposed to be, quite frankly, after school, because they went to school and on their way home from school. So those kinds of things I think are really important. And I will just, I'll throw out, because we have really, as a defender community, been thinking about how do we use research well? And we've developed a series of tips when we're arguing whether it's developmental research, the implicit racial bias research, trauma research, and now this play research, is the need not to overstate the research, right? The need, in this work to find articles. And literally, we're going to give you all after this session, if everybody who attended or even who registered, an annotated bibliography on the play research. And, helping think about how do you use this research well, specifically research on adolescent development, adolescence and play. And so these are just some helpful thoughts about how to use and to think about the research in our work.
Wonderful. So I love all of that. And it's so concrete in terms of the writing we can do. And I just want to underscore, Linda, if for those of us who've been doing this for a long time, when we read Chris's book, we're kind of like, really? We haven't been including this stuff in our motions? Like, we've been doing this for 25 years. You guys have been doing this for longer than that. So it's so important for us to have access to the work that you've been doing. And it impacts our interviewing, it impacts our motions. But the other piece of this that we're also really realizing is it impacts our trial theory and actual charges that young people are facing as they engage in play, recreation, and leisure. Chris, can you brainstorm with us a little bit about how we could use this research at the trial stage?
Well, just as you made that comment about how we didn't know, right? We've been doing all of this. I'm going to tell you, until I started writing The Rage of Innocence, I didn't even know that there was a whole discipline of studies. There are whole departments on play, recreation, and leisure that often fall under parks and recreation. So NC State, for example, has a department of parks and recreation that parks and forestry, I think it might be. And then within that is this whole discipline. So right off the bat, when you ask the question, I'm thinking calling expert witnesses, right? To educate us, like Dr. Caldwell, right? So that's huge. I think trial theories, again, as I mentioned earlier, thinking about criminal intent, right? Is it normal adolescent impulsivity and play and risk-taking, as Linda talked about, or is it true mens rea, criminal intent to harm, right? And so again, that Lionel Tate is the one that really just sticks out to me among others. And maybe as I'm talking, I'd love to see in the chat. I always learn a lot from these webinars, like what have you seen by way of trial theories, but others like gang labels, right? So the ways in which socialization with friends, wearing the same colors, sitting at the same table, living in the same neighborhood, playing the same games, and even getting into mischief together, is common all across the world, regardless of race, class, ethnicity, region of the world and country. Yet, we know that Black and brown children are often labeled as gang members. And so I think that's really important to think about how this developmental research around play and leisure, who do you associate with? And then I also think, I'm thinking about trial theories. It made me think about education advocacy, because so much of the criminalization or the arrests come from schools. So to what extent are we connected with education advocates in the school system that can help, right? With discovery, with investigation, of course, but also when I know this is trial theories, but I still think about systemic reform, right? Can I push back at like particularly with my kids, my clients who have a disability, right? A learning disability or emotional disability, and the ways in which they perceive play. And I think this goes to Linda's point about context matters, idiosyncrasies matter, and that what a kid with a disability perceives to be fun, recreation, and play might be perceived as dangerous or threatening. And so on that education front, can I get ahead of it? Can I do a manifestation hearing in that education realm, right? That I can then use what I learned and from that defense at the school front to fight off a delinquency trial in the courthouse. So I'm sort of just spinning ideas out.
Yeah, and Chris said this, so, to brainstorm with Chris and Linda, but also for those of you who are participants, we invite you in the chat to talk about what are some trial theories you can imagine you could use with this research on play and the elements of play, especially now that we have a better understanding of the developmental benefits of play. We just invite you to put those in the chat as we continue this conversation. And, Chris said this already. It really was remarkable to us that we weren't using this research in detention, where we know young people are denied access to autonomy and decision-making and self-determination. But the other place where this is so critically important, of course, is disposition. And, Chris, can you talk to us a little bit about the disposition phase and how we might be able to use this work there? And then, Linda, I'm going to come over to you and just ask, based on this giant brainstorm, if you have thoughts for us on how we could use your work. Chris.
Yeah, and again, I think this is a lot of it is brainstorming as we're still working this out and drafting motions. But thinking about disposition advocacy, maybe even like the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, to deprive a child of some of the critically important developmental benefits of recreation, play, and leisure. So if you find out, so again, it's that point of asking our clients about, and I guess this maybe gets into conditions of confinement, but what does it look like, right? If you get sentenced, so finding out on the front end, what does a young person's day look like if they've been transferred to adult court in an adult prison? Often they're segregated from, sometimes, they need, segregated from adults. If that's the case, then are they excluded from some of their play and recreation time? So in advance, even of that disposition hearing, being able to argue what will be lost. One of our colleagues, Hedgie Kim, and I should give shout outs to all our team members, Alina Tulla, Hedgie Kim, KK, all the folks Reba Omer, who have been helping us draft some of these pleadings. And, we have a draft of a release play schedule. In other words, can we attach to our disposition letters for a judge what we call in DC a 24/7 plan that incorporates built-in time for play, recreation, and engagement with peers, and accompanying that visual chart, we would explain why those periods within the schedule are so critically important. So those are some things that I'm thinking about. I'm also thinking about practitioners who offer play therapy. We've seen an uptick in therapy dogs in our courthouses, but using that, intentionally in ways that are helpful for the child. I would say also, finally, opposing conditions of probation, similar to what I talked about earlier, opposing conditions of probation that interfere significantly with play, like stay away orders, stay away from places, from people, and at certain times, all of which can impede play.
Thanks so much, Chris. And I love that, Chris mentioned it has been common sense. We've asked for judges to recognize how ridiculous this is for young people to literally stay away from all of their friends. But now we've got research to back it up. Linda, do you have other thoughts for us? Do you want to add to this brainstorm on how we could use this in our advocacy?
Well, I'm not sure if anything I have to say will be helpful, but I was thinking, one thing would be to help judges and others really understand the situation and the, that they're not doing anything criminal. They're just playing. They're just doing what they do. And here's why they're doing it. And maybe to give the youth offenders some language themselves so that they can understand what they've done. So how do I explain this, what I was doing to somebody else? Like, put it in words that would express that they were doing something playful or something fun and not criminal. So help them with that language. Certainly in terms of in detention, and I don't know the system at all, but I'm thinking that even if they don't have the opportunity to have access to social situations that would be conducive to recreation, leisure, play, even solitary opportunities. And you use play therapy, Chris, and that's what I was thinking is that I grew up with one area of my interest called therapeutic recreation, and worked in mental health facilities and stuff. And I think that it doesn't all have to be group or something. It can be also something that's palliative, that's therapeutic to the individual who's, not able to do what we would like this person to be able to do. So, so in some way having be restorative and maybe help that person deal with the situation that they're in through doing something that might be creative or personally meaningful, even again, if it's not a social situation. I don't know if any of that makes any sense.
Absolutely. No, that was helpful in terms of us helping judges understand and recognize that young people are literally engaging in play, right? And that's the pushing back on criminalization of play. So some of you are saying, great, other countries recognize the right to play. We don't recognize the right to play. So how are we supposed to hook this into our advocacy in addition to what Chris is saying? Well, we want to think about what the constitutional basis might be for some of this. We know that, young people are over surveilled. There's an absence of green space. There's structures of racism that deny them, Black, Latino, Indigenous young people, access to play. Chris, what's the legal framework for this? How do we get to it?
Well, I mean, so all of so I think of it as from the macro frame and the micro frame. And I think we've been talking about some of the micro ways in which we could do it at each stage of the case, detention, trial, disposition. But maybe there is a macro argument to be made around the right to play, both from an international human rights lens, but also from a U.S. constitutional equity lens. I think we've already given a nod to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as a potential human rights framework. But of course, everybody knows it has not been, adopted in the United States. But in terms of making arguments in the US, drawing that language, I often call it shaming, shaming us for the fact that this is such a critical right. It's included in the UN CRC, and yet we haven't adopted it. But then beyond that, for folks who are interested in reading further around sort of the constitutional rights framework, I like some of the work from Professor Nancy Dowd, who talks about developmental equity, right? And she's thinking about developmental equity in the sense that the government has a responsibility, right? And that any ways in which you talked about structural racism, Mary Ann, the ways in which the state imposes barriers and structures that negatively impact the developmental trajectory of children is a problem of constitutional magnitude, right? So that's one way of thinking about it. So at a much more practical level, thinking about maybe a Fourth Amendment equal protection argument, right, as a basis for this developmental equity argument. If government policies lead to inequities in education, mental and physical health, housing, poverty, safety, participation in the workforce, then is the state responsible for that inequity, that developmental inequity. Now, Nancy Dowd has never taken this to talk about play, right? So, but is there also a right to play, which is absolutely consistent with some of the other, for those of you who are interested, again, in more reading by Margaret Beale Spencer, talking about, the developmental harms, or how the developmental trajectory is shaped by context and environment. So I'm putting some pieces together to get us to think about, the equal protection argument. Also thinking about substantive due process arguments. Substantive due process protects the public from unwarranted government intrusion, right? That infringes upon our fundamental right to life, liberty, and property. And so we think often about, those enumerated rights, like the Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. We certainly can make those arguments. But even beyond that, right, we know that there are certain rights that have not been enumerated in the Constitution, such as the right to marriage, the right to parental custody, among others. And so again, because play is so foundational to development, maybe there is a substantive due process argument that government policies that interfere with play and deprive youth of a healthy feature is a violation of substantive due process. I'll stop there, but we can think about First Amendment arguments, that the fact that freedom of expression and freedom of assembly are often so critical in periods of recreation and leisure. I talked about this a little bit earlier with protest, civic engagement, and the like. I think also about, so that's sort of on the constitutional framework, but then also finally at the conditions of confinement, pattern or practice challenges, right? Denial of recreation from a pattern and practice lens, the Civil Rights of Institutional Persons Act, and the Violent Crime and Control Law Enforcement Act give the United States Department of Civil Rights an opportunity to challenge constitutional and federal violations, I should say, of constitutional and federal statutory rights of people in youth prisons and in jails. So these are just some things really on a quick brainstorm that I can come up with.
So thanks, Chris. I invite the audience. I hope that many of you will begin to think about and use these constitutional frameworks. I invite you just to put in the chat as we're wrapping up, and we're going to try to get to a few questions, just to put your own ideas about which of these constitutional pieces you think you might be able to advance. We would love to work with you on how we can put these arguments together in states all across the country where young people are being criminalized for accessing play, recreation, and leisure. So we got a few questions. Dr. Caldwell, I'm going to ask you a complex question, and you can just say that you're not familiar because we're not familiar. But there was a question about whether or not you are familiar with something called gamification as a model in treating young people with traits of being callous and unemotional as it's defined in the DSM-5. Are you familiar with that model?
No, I'm not. I'm sorry.
Okay. Neither are we. To the person who asked it, we will all try to dig into that and figure it out.
Wow.
Earlier, Dr. Caldwell, you did talk about trauma and mental health and its impact on sensation seeking. So I think that question was answered. Chris and Dr. Caldwell, we got another question about what's the best way to take on negative imagery in the media about Black, Latino, and Indigenous youth that spills over into the legal system and leads to the criminalization of play. Chris actually had almost a whole webinar, a chapter of the month on this. Chris, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, well, definitely worth watching. But I think a part of it is it's the whole, shifting the narrative, shifting the literally the traditional stereotypical narrative. So figuring out ways in which we get positive, affirming stories before the media, right? It is really about us as the defense bar, really shaping and working with the press around what's being published. And I've, really been fortunate. I've had a couple of opportunities to be invited to small workshops with folks in the press about what are the top 10 tips for, telling a story that is coming out of the criminal legal system. So we talk about dig deeper, don't accept what you are given at face value in police reports, know your, understand adolescent development. There are more tips. We'll have to, maybe find those and send those out to you, and also send you the link to the webinar. I'm trying to think of what some of the other tips are, dispelling some of the myths about adolescent crime, reminding folks that the vast majority of children are not in court for serious violent offenses, but instead are there for minor adolescent behaviors, sometimes minor adolescent behaviors that went awry. So it's a lot about narrative shifting and working with the press one-on-one to get the stories right.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to do a wrap up, quick round robin with our two guests, and ask them, what can we as youth defenders, advocates, all of us who are on this space with you today, do to support liberating play spaces for young people, especially Black, Latino, and Indigenous young people? Linda, I'm going to ask you first.
I'm not sure I have anything else to say. Just that I'm just so excited to be part of this, and so excited to hear what you're doing, and that you are talking about ways to be able to demonstrate and explain why play, recreation, leisure is so important, critical to healthy human development and academic. It's going to take a lot of people working together. It takes a village kind of thing. And I'm just so excited by what you're doing, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Well, we're really grateful to you for having done this life's work of research so that we can now incorporate it into our advocacy. And same question to you. So Chris, what can we do? So we've talked a lot about frontline advocacy. What can we do to create liberating spaces of play for young people? Yeah,
I think actually one of the things, Linda said, what was really important is that it takes a village, and that village is an interdisciplinary village. And so exactly as Mary Ann said, it's partnering with folks who have done this research and truly, there is the U.S. Play Coalition that Dr. Moat and Dr. Pinckney are involved in. There is the crit play research that we all have to know about. I think we have to get that information. And I saw in the chat, someone mentioned that, like all the judges and, DAs and probation officers and defense bar, not to let anybody off, needs to learn this stuff, right? Maybe watching the webinars, sharing the webinars with other folks, and really advocating at the local level for access to anti-oppressive, nonviolent, free of law enforcement spaces, right? So having play safe zones. And we as defenders, I think, are uniquely equipped to be involved in some of that advocacy. I know in our vast amounts of free time, but to be involved in that advocacy because we have case examples of ways in which young people have been denied. And then finally, I would just say, just as we've been talking about in this webinar, being exceedingly creative about thinking of ways in which we can apply at a concrete level all of this research in our advocacy, written, oral, and informal negotiation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much, Linda. I just want to underscore one last comment that Linda made. In our advocacy, advocating for play helps judges ignite passions in youth that will serve all of us in the future of what we see in our communities. I hope that this research and conversation will help you in the work that you're doing with young people. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Thank you, Dr. Linda Caldwell, for all the research you've done. Thank you, as always, Professor Chris Henning, for everything you give to this community, for your thinking and brainstorming about how we can strengthen youth defense advocacy, and really begin to grow a right to play for young people all across this country, especially young people in Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities. Let's create those open, non-oppressed, non-violent spaces for youth and stop criminalizing play. Thank you all so much.